And voila.
There we go.
Sorry about that
Okay.
all.
No worries. Good to see you.
Oh, audio. There we go. Okay.
Oh, perfect.
And how does this sound? Because I can also try it on my little Bluetooth headphones. I just don't know.
Sounds excellent.
Sounds good now.
Okay. Good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
On this.
It's good to see you.
You as well.
It's been a while. Yes. So thanks for joining us for the podcast. We really appreciate it. So we usually just spend about a half an hour talking to folks about little things that make a difference in the educational world. And I know you've got a lot of experience addressing issues of equity in our system. So why don't you start off by just telling us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah. So my background in education, I'll talk about education and also equity. So really begin on the media side. And so I joined a company called School Improvement Network, and my focus was actually on media, on going into classrooms and filming excellent teachers and what they do. And so it was, I did not enter the classroom, or I did not enter education through the classroom, through teaching, et cetera. I entered education through filming over 20 years in about 3,000 different classrooms. So every state, most of the provinces in Canada, several other countries. It was a fascinating experience. I mean, I felt much more, at times like a researcher, a sociologist. Someone even called me a cultural archaeologist at one point, because we were really going in and observing these schools, both the schools in terms of the leadership, but also the classroom in terms of the teacher practice, and identifying what are those practices that exist that ultimately connect all students to the learning. And so that was my intro into education. As part of this program, my intro into race and equity was we did a program at one point featuring Glenn Singleton. And Glenn Singleton originated the concept of courageous conversations about race. And so I was pulled into this, flew to Oakland, filmed a workshop, had never heard anyone talk about race quite like Glenn had. And it was both eye-opening and earth-shattering all at the same time. And this was in 2001. So this was several years before Obama, before our nation started to get a little more conscious and open about issues of race. And so it was particularly earth-shattering for a white guy who grew up in Sandy, Utah, and believed in his own, acceptance and inclusivity of everybody. I was even living in Koreatown in Los Angeles at the time, having what I called my cultural experience. So to be thrust into a very honest conversation about race, forced me to reconsider myself, unlike almost anything I'd ever gone through.
Wow. Yeah. So, and then you ended up writing a book with Glenn, right?
Yes. Yeah. So we filmed that program, and let me actually share a little story around it. And this is,
please.
So I filmed a 2-day workshop in Oakland. We went to Denver, filmed another 2-day workshop. So by this point, I've spent, 4 8-hour days watching Glenn interact with the audience, hearing the audience's responses. We then went to Chapel Hill, North Carolina, and filmed yet again another 2-day workshop. So I had a fast, dunk into courageous conversations about race. And so after our first day in Chapel Hill, we went to a little restaurant, and it's fascinating. I mean, this is 19 years ago, and Glenn and I both remember this experience quite clearly. And we're sitting in this restaurant called Crook's Corner, and I'm having my first plate of shrimp and grits. Marvelous. Crook's Corner is known for it. I have a whole theory around how food activates the rest of the senses, and so intensifies the conversation you're having with someone. So there, Glenn and I are sharing a dinner of shrimp and grits. We're outside on the patio. We know where the sun is setting. We know how warm it is. And we're talking through these issues. And I had this light bulb moment come on. And what I'm about to share is so simple, it's obvious. But this is, part of the challenge of the work in race and equity is that the only story we actually know is our own. And so as we move into trying to understand the experience of other people, we have to go through those light bulb moments of incredibly simple discoveries in order to really understand it. And so there we are. And one of the things that I had connected myself with to what Glenn was talking about in terms of being different and being othered, particularly in academic and professional settings, was my own Mormon upbringing. And so living outside of Utah, working outside of Utah, in Los Angeles, I had a lot of consciousness around this Mormon heritage and how people misunderstood it. Even in graduate school, there was one of my colleagues who literally asked me, okay, so your one wife came down with you to LA. Did your other wife stay back in Utah? And it wasn't a joke. She actually thought that was the case. So I'm carrying those personal stories about being othered because of my heritage, my identity. And so that's how I was processing this whole honest conversation about race. So there, Glenn and I are sitting again with the shrimp and grits, and the sun is setting. And I'm, oh my gosh. Okay. So Glenn, the difference is when I walk in the room, I have to announce my Mormon heritage in order to invite prejudice against my background. But when you enter the room, and he looks at me and goes, yes. And one thing I didn't say is Glenn's Black. He's a Black educator from the Bay Area. He goes, yes, that's it. And so simple, right? Absolutely simple. But for me, I had never considered that the presence of racial difference, and now let's go into a bit of brain theory, or brain research around this. So the visual part of your brain processes information at about 1,000 frames per second. So the moment I see somebody, my mind is racing through and trying to take that image of another person and connect it to some sort of understanding. The brain's always searching for understanding. So if I see someone, if I see Glenn who is Black, within 1,000th of a second, his image is now attached to whatever I think about Black people. Now, auditory information processes at about the speed of talking. So even though Glenn and I are talking and let me use an incredibly old racist trope, he's articulate and educated and confident and all these other things. The problem is, in the first 1,000th of a second, I've already landed judgments on him. And that's why race, leads to racism, and racism is so insidious because our mind is rendering judgments based on a person's visual image rather than on who they actually are. But it takes too long for the mind to process who this person might be. I've already landed in my judgments. And then that pushes my interpretation of this other person, no matter how smart they may be, how accomplished they may be, how sincere and generous and honest, and let's go all the, how much grit they have, how much perseverance they have. Every single time I'm analyzing this other person, it is literally colored by the color of their skin. Because the judgment in my mind has already been rendered.
Yeah. So how do you work around that, especially when you're working with teachers who are very well-meaning, who, there's a book Robin DiAngelo wrote called White Fragility that talks about how hard it is for white teachers to have conversations because any suggestion of racism or privilege is met with, not me. I mean, I'm a nice person. I care about kids.
Right.
I mean well. And then what often happens is that those individuals can sometimes co-opt the conversation because it then becomes about making them feel better. No, right. You're not a racist. Yeah. We understand you're a good person. And so then all of a sudden the focus has been taken away from the issues of race and racism that we started out with, and now is about making this person feel like they're okay. I mean, that's Robin
Yeah.
DiAngelo's story in White Fragility. How have you approached this as a white person talking to white teachers?
Yes. So I'm going to go very personal on you. And Jim, you've participated in some of my workshops in the past, but I tend to think about particularly educational equity within a personal, professional, and institutional lens. So the personal, who am I? The professional, what do I do? The institutional, who are we? And one reason why I break it apart that way is because it's too easy for teachers to say, oh, you're preaching to the choir. I mean, as been said so many times. Probably was said in one of the workshops we did back in the 2007, 2008. You're preaching to the choir. You got to talk to the school board. Oh, you got to talk to the legislature. You're preaching to the choir. Well, if I'm preaching to the choir based upon this school district's performance, the choir doesn't sound that good. So let's actually break this apart so that we're going to tackle, elements of equity and, the really embracing equity. And I want to talk about the evidence side of equity in a bit, because equity and anti-racism get woven together, but it's different work that has to occur for both of them. So on the racism side, from the personal, who am I? The first piece is that racism is an addiction. And the reason it's an addiction is because when we can quickly render a judgment on someone else, it feels very self-validating. And so I can't ever conquer my inner racism, ever. It will always be there. I mean, to this day, I have to check myself. I mean, and if I'm honest about it, there are some scary judgments that I render deep internally that I'll never admit to anybody. But man, those thoughts are passing through my mind. So if racism is an addiction, the reason the fragility is there is because we're challenging someone's addiction. And quite frankly, none of us like our addictions being challenged. No, I had a really hard day. I deserve that cookie. I mean, it's like I just need this drink to bring the edge down. That's all. And so if it,
go ahead. No, well, finish up.
So that's the first thing I have to acknowledge is that I will never fundamentally conquer my racism. So then how do I deal with it? And so here's the personal story around this. I adopted both my children. Both my children are African American. They're Black. And so, my wife and I, we went through years of infertility. Pregnancy could not be accomplished. We finally realized we were more interested in being parents than we were in achieving a pregnancy. So we entered into the world of adoption. The fascinating thing about the world of adoption, and we're talking here in Utah. Utah leads the nation in transracial adoption. So more white families adopting children of color here in Utah than any other state per capita. And actually it's per capita, and it's actually in real numbers as well.
Oh, wow. That's an interesting statistic.
That is interesting.
Yes. And there's some fascinating things about Utah culture and Mormon culture and whatnot that leads to this. And my wife and I experienced this. And so there you are in the adoption agency, and you have to fill out a profile saying we're willing to accept this and we are not willing to accept this. And one of those is it lays out race. It says, are you willing to adopt, a full African-American child, a half African-American child, full Latino, a half, and it feels so guilty to mark anything less than, yes, we're willing to accept it. And so, and we worked, part of the work we do is with the Domino Foundation, which my wife and I started. And the whole purpose of the Domino Foundation is to support transracial adoption families with education and social engagement. So we've had a lot of conversation with parents over the years around transracial adoption and why they entered into this. And so as a good-hearted person, remember, most of us are growing up here in Utah where we are not growing up with people of color. And our experience of color tends to mostly be serving a mission in Brazil, where we're there as a missionary in some role of authority, in some role of, the sense of importance. So I'm reaching out, I'm loving these people because that's what I'm expected to do. And so growing up in Utah, I enter race in a very naive fashion. Race, my experience around race is not based on relationships. It's based on social, on media. It's based on, ideas and whatnot. So obviously I'm a loving person. So obviously I can adopt a child of color. I'd never reject that. That's very racist. So parents suddenly have a child of color, white parents, baby of color. And so the reason why I'm sharing this is that when I adopted my son, Dominic, the fascinating thing is I finished my work on Courageous Conversations basically 2 months before Dominic was born. So I come out of writing that book and suddenly I'm the father of a Black son. And I'm having to process that. And so when you adopt a child, they come into your home and they're entirely dependent upon you. You have to feed them. You have to change their diapers. You have to do everything that happens when you birth a baby. And, do a week of that and you love this child fully. You are 100% committed to them because you realize this baby does not survive unless you step in and you give them 24-hour care. And so we have Dominic for about 3 years, and he's my child. I'm incredibly used to holding him, And my brother has a child, has a new baby, and we go over, and I hold my nephew, who honestly looks much more like me than my own son does, but it didn't feel right. And so then it was just a few months later we adopted our daughter, who's also African American, and looks much more like my son than my nieces and nephews do, and it felt right. And so there's this fascinating thing where my visualization as to what I perceive as my child shifted because of experience and proximity. And so all those years of holding this baby and touching them and hearing them and loving them changed a visual conception within my mind. So when I see a Black person, my first judgment that's rendered is my own children. And then all the other stuff comes in. So there has to be experience within this in order to honestly start challenging that propensity to racist judgment. And it cannot be through just intellectual conversation. Because when you think about how the brain works, the brain prioritizes emotional connection over intellectual connection. So yes, I can go out and read White Fragility and go, wow, what a book. Man, that really impacted me. Well, frankly, it's a pretty stoic book. It's very guarded on the personal side. It's about the actions of White Fragility rather than the emotions of White Fragility. And so I can change my actions, but my emotions and my judgments persist. And I learn really well how to make sure that no one sees what's going on internally.
Yeah, so I can read White Fragility and pat myself on the back, and then I go home to my white neighborhood where I don't, I don't surround myself. I don't have a lot of friends of color, and that's, I think that's kind of what you're speaking to, is that we can kind of immerse ourselves in these concepts, but unless we kind of take it on as as something personal, then it's going to be really hard to affect some of those biases that we carry around with us. Tracy, you were going to say something a little bit earlier.
Well, I'm very curious about, as you've kind of gone down the path and you started at this place where you were collecting all these videos and you went to, 3,000 different exemplar classrooms, if you will, because these were strong, passionate teachers. And then you moved into this other work. And I'm curious if you make connections, what kind of overlap do you see about those who were exemplary teachers and the work that you've been doing in Courageous Conversations?
Well, so immense overlap. I mean, so in all honesty, over time, it's caused me to lose a lot of faith in education. And that's a hard thing to admit. Teachers are heroes. I mean, public education is an absolute must. I think during this time of COVID shutdown, watching my 2 kids not go to school every day, their lives are being hammered because of this. And Zoom is great. My daughter has Zoom classes every day. I'm so glad she has that. My son has to go on the canvas and check off some boxes, but fundamentally they are losing out in a big way. And it's very disturbing, I mean, as a parent. And, and they say nationally, a third of kids have not logged in. They haven't shown up.
Yeah.
And so we're really discovering that, first off, education is an absolute fundamental. Secondly, we've been treating schools as babysitting so parents can work. And this has shown, this last couple months has shown that as much as anything. But so when we talk about, so I say I have this lack of faith in public education. The higher the system, the higher we go up in the systemic nature of school, the less faith I have in it. So I can find in any city an amazing teacher who knows how to connect with all the kids, in his or her classroom. In any city, I can find a school that for the most part is connecting with and serving all of its students. It is near impossible to find a district that does this.
Yeah.
And it's completely impossible to find a state. So there are small little districts, 6 to 7 schools. It's a feeder system, 3 or 4 elementaries, a couple middle schools, 1 high school, highly connected all the way through. The superintendent knows all the students. Yeah, some of those districts are doing it. But you go much beyond that. And the further you go up into the system, the more it is about compliance. And so when we're talking about how this impacts students in the classroom, so this is an example in Salt Lake School District that happened this last year. So there's a Black student, goes into a new school, and it's actually a great school. And I feel kind of guilty because I recommended to the parents that they get their son into the school. Other kids, he's a Black kid, he's transracial adoption, transracially adopted. Another kid is using the N-word on him, which happens quite often. It's happened to my son numerous times. My son will be walking through the hall and someone will come up and like, hey, I've got the N pass, right? I've got the N pass. Well, the impasse is when a Black person gives their non-Black friend the right to call them the N-word. How's my son going to respond? Well, no, you don't have it. He's a 14-year-old kid. He goes, yeah, and then gets really disturbed and comes home and takes it out at home. So this is common. This happens all the time. So this other boy is in this middle school here in Salt Lake. Another kid is, keeps using the N-word on him. And he finally snaps one day and punches the other kid. Well, because of the way zero tolerance is written at the district level, the boy who punches gets suspended, but the boy who uses the N-word does not. So that's a systemic issue. And all compliance and the paperwork is done and the boxes are checked. But whose education is now destroyed?
Right.
Who doesn't trust the school and the system? The person using the slur or the victim?
Right.
And sure, the other kid got punched, but maybe he needed to be punched. That's a really tough thing to say in today's world, right? But he was using a slur to demean another student on a regular basis and would not stop.
Right.
So he was bullying.
So what are some little things that educators can do to address some of these issues? You talk about, the capacity of the individual educator or even a school to be able to affect some of these changes where maybe a larger organization is not able to. So what are some little things that we can take to our listeners that they could be doing tomorrow?
So first piece is visualization of the students in the classroom. When a student walks into that classroom, to what degree do they see themselves represented there? And so part of the challenge with this is that there's multicultural approaches to this, which seem quick and easy. So, my son's 9th grade class is reading To Kill a Mockingbird. Okay, it's courageous on the part of the teacher. It's one of the classics, right? So yes, it represents addressing race. How does it present the Black person within the story? Who's the hero? So my son is Black, sitting in a classroom of, and his classroom is actually quite diverse. I mean, there's a lot of kids of color within his classroom, but he's one of the only Black kids. And so the main Black character in To Kill a Mockingbird is the victim, is not actually a hero. requires a white person to come in and save him.
Mm-hmm.
I love To Kill a Mockingbird. It impacted me dramatically when I read it. But I have a personal connection. The hero character in To Kill a Mockingbird looks and sounds like me.
Mm-hmm.
But yet to my son, okay, so I've got to wait till the white people show up. The good white people show up and take care of me.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not actually representative, even though it might be multicultural.
Yeah, we
Does
had a
that make sense?
conversation. We had a conversation with Matthew Kay several episodes back about this very thing, where he talked about teaching the Lord of the Flies, and seemingly that would be race neutral, but he's able to really engage his students in a conversation about how the white boys in that story become savage, and that there are lots of references to race, even within what we presume to be a race neutral book. So having those racial conversations, I think, around text is so important for kids.
Yeah. See, and it also has to go towards intersectionality and the broad definition of diversity. And so if a teacher is willing to take on race but not take on sexual orientation, willing to take on race but not take on religion, not take on politics, not take on economics, classism, all these other things, well, then the students of color in the classroom are hyper-visualized, hyper-visible. Because, oh, this teacher just keeps going back to race, and are they going to ask me about it? I'm a kid going through adolescence, and I'm struggling like every other kid here to fit in, and I'm really worried about the spotlight being shined on me because this teacher is so courageously talking about race. It's all they talk about.
Yeah.
And so it's norming the difference. And so, the teachers who really figure this out, connect with all the kids, and, they are not going out of their way to make sure they give attention to the child of color in the classroom.
Mm-hmm.
They're going out of the way to validate the differences that every single student shows up with, including the rich, white, straight, male boy from the hill whose parents might be separated. Who never gets to see his dad, who's a lawyer who works, 120 hours a week. That's the story that kid shows up with. And so a teacher who's going to connect with students who are different from themselves will also connect with students who are like themselves. We don't have an equitable classroom if suddenly all the attention is just given to racial difference. Because now those few kids of color in the classroom have to represent an entire cultural experience, and especially because we're talking about Utah, that student of colors expect to represent a cultural experience that they might never have experienced. My kids are growing up in a white neighborhood. My kids actually aren't so much African American, but they are unquestionably Black. And so if they have to answer, if they're expected to answer for the African American experience, they might not actually have the background to answer for that. And it's because my kids are growing up in a very unique environment. They have two white parents, and, we live in the avenues, and there's some diversity around here. There's a lot of religious diversity, economic diversity, political diversity, a little bit of racial diversity. And so can my kids show up in a classroom and be treated for exactly who they are, rather than for who the teacher is expecting them to be? And I think that's the fundamental basis of equity is, can I take a child for exactly who they show up being? Or am I in a constant judgment as to, do they live up to my standard? So take grit. I love attacking the idea of grit.
Ooh, controversial, because educators love grit.
They love grit.
Right, Tracy?
And why do they love grit?
Yeah.
Why do they love grit? Because they knew they showed grit when they succeeded in school. And so they're taking their personal value and they're projecting it on their students. Well, a teacher said this to me last year. Well, I wait for the students. I expect the students to develop grit and persistence. And so they need to come talk to me. No, teacher, man, that's a pass. That's an excuse. That means the kids who know how the system works and connect very easily with you are showing a lot of grit because they keep coming and talking to you. Whereas the students who cannot connect with you and really struggle to understand who you are avoiding you.
Mm.
And so you're judging them because they lack grit, except you don't actually know who these kids are. You know what? You don't know what kind of grit they're showing in their life outside of your classroom. So you're using a moment where an adolescent or a teenager who's trying to figure out how the world works and might not have made a personal connection to you and has seen you call out other kids who don't participate, as well as the 4 or 5 white kids sitting on the front row who really love this class. You're calling the kids on the front row, you're loving them because they have grit and persistence and they value their education and they love school and all the rest. But what about the kids who won't approach you? Whose responsibility is it? Is it the students or is it the teachers? And the teachers who are really good go to those students. And they figure out, oh, this student really recoils when I approach him in class. Okay, I got to find another way to connect to him. It's so the good teachers are they track how it is that they connect with each and every one of their students. And yes, they have 150 students, in a middle school or high school setting. But that's not intimidating to them because really, once you've made a connection with the student, it takes a lot less time and effort to stay connected with that student. And so as we're going through it, is the teacher, and going back to what you asked, Tracy, about what can teachers do? First off, is the student visible in the classroom in a normed sense of being rather than, an exotic or hero sense of being? So I might have a multicultural classroom, except for I haven't normed the experience of race and color. I only highlight the heroes.
Mm.
That's not exactly attainable. So how do I norm this? Am I making sure that the literature, the art, the stories that we're talking about are reflective of that student's community? Maybe I don't always use the history book and we focus on the history of our community. I mean, how much history can be learned by having students interview someone on their street? Well, what happens when you do that is it is absolutely culturally proficient for the student because they're talking about their world. They're researching their own world, which is far more prescient and conscious in the child's mind than a history that might have happened at the other end of the country, 150 years ago. It doesn't mean we don't need to teach those things. Absolutely, we must. But until a student believes that what I'm learning is reflective of my own life, then all that other stuff is just out there. It's abstracted. And so the good teachers, are my students represented? Are they visible within my classroom, within the work we do? Am I personally connected to each of my students? Which means as a teacher, I'm going out of my way. I'm making myself feel uncomfortable so the students aren't the ones who have to carry that burden. So you think about what is visible, what is the connection we have, but then there's another piece in this as well, and it is about quality and standards and engagement and all the rest. And unfortunately, the way that our school systems work is we are really good at grading, intensely good at grading. And why are teachers so good at grading? Because they were really good at getting good grades back when they were in school. So our modern day school system is almost a think back to the carbon copy machines, that you'd roll. Well, each new generation of teachers, in essence, feels most comfortable within a carbon copy of the school that they went through.
Mm.
Because, barely single digits of teachers enter the profession after being bad students. Almost every teacher was a good student. They trust the system as it is because it worked for them. Why do I love education? Because I was a damn good student. I'm still a good student. I went back to school at 44 years old and loved it.
Yeah. So Curtis, we're almost out of time, but I want you to be able to talk about kind of your books that you have that are available for teachers to look at? Because I know you've written more than just Courageous Conversations. And then if you'll talk really briefly just about if you could go back in a time machine and talk to your younger self, give your younger self a little bit of advice, what would you say?
Let me start with that one first, because that one's more
Okay.
emotionally resonant. Life is just super messy. Keep plugging. Just go through it and embrace failure, embrace conflict. Learn authentically rather than learn for grades and scholarships. Mess up. I mean, in all honesty, mess up. It's probably the number one thing I'd say to my younger self.
Nice.
Yeah. So, because honestly, that's been one of my real struggles. When we're talking about racism and being inclusive and all the rest, is that I really know how to work this system. I know how to appear successful, and which means I carry a constant judgment against others who might not appear in the same way. So, so I have to learn how to embrace messiness and imperfection, because we're all that. It's just a matter of how much we allow that to come out. The other books that I've written, both are titled Equity 101. And so what the equity framework is, it's a concept that I developed, and it was actually in response to all of these schools and classrooms that we had featured. And so after working with Glenn on Courageous Conversations, continuing to do this work where we were filming in schools, I started a project where we went out and we found individual schools that had either statistically closed their achievement gaps or were showing significant enough progress that that they could say that they were closing within a few years. And so we really wanted to go out and say, in these schools, what are they doing? And so the equity framework derives out of that work of not going in with a concept saying, we think we have the answer already, we're going to verify it. It was really just analyzing schools, listening to the teachers and leaders, talking to the students, the parents, and trying to figure out, why are these schools successful? And so what the equity framework, in essence presents is that first and foremost, it's focused on equity. And the way we define equity in the book is that, teachers hold the responsibility to guarantee that all students succeed to an acceptable standard. And so it really puts the emphasis, the responsibility on teachers have to do the work. It's not the legislature's fault. It's not the parents' fault. It's not the community's fault. It's not the principal's fault. It's really no one's fault. It's the responsibility of the teacher in the classroom to connect with each and every student. And so an equitable school is not one where kids of color do really well and other kids don't. An equitable school is where all kids come in and believe that they are achieving to their greatest potential. And so how is it that a school goes in, or a teacher goes in and really thinks about the progress of the student rather than the performance of the student? And so I'm far less interested in terms of where a student is in relation to grade level. I'm much more interested in how is a student growing and progressing each and every year. My own daughter has been perpetually a couple years behind. But there are certain classes where she is progressing at a very rapid rate. So if I use a traditional measurement, we need to be highly concerned. If I watch her and observe her, she's doing great. It's just her performance comes in conflict with the traditional way we measure student performance. So an equitable teacher is one who really looks at that and thinks about each and every one of those, individual students, what they show up with, who they are, and how they're progressing. And then the other thing that we did in the equity framework is that we divided it into leadership, culture, and practice. And so thinking through, these are schools that deliberately address issues of equity at the leadership level. How is it that leaders tackle this? What is the role of a leader within this? But then also really delineating between culture and practice. And so part of the challenge in all these schools we visited is we'd sometimes go into schools which had really figured out a lot of those classroom practices, how to intervene with students, how to engage them, the strategies and whatnot that are used, the pedagogical aspect, the science side of it. But they really couldn't talk honestly and forthrightly about race and culture and difference and all the rest. So they figured out the practice side, but not the culture. But then we were in other schools where, I mean, they were having these amazing, courageous conversations, and they were all pumped about it, but their pedagogy was weak. And so, yes, students felt visible and felt recognized, except for they weren't really learning that much. And so in these schools that were achieving some degree of equity, they were very deliberate and conscious about addressing culture and practice in parallel. You know, and so constantly saying, how are we engaging in those courageous conversations? How are we challenging our biases? How are we changing the culture of our school? How are we reaching out to the community? And what are the strategies we're implementing in the classroom? What is our coaching process? How are we helping teachers lift up their practice? How are we holding students accountable and supporting them? And so it's both. It's both. You know, I can fertilize my lawn, but not water it. My lawn will die.
That's a good analogy.
Yeah.
I can water my lawn, but not fertilize it, and it's not going to be healthy. I have to do both.
We so appreciate you coming and joining us this morning, Chris. We wish we had more time to continue on the conversation. So I hope you're open to us inviting you back. I feel like there's a lot that we've left on the table that we haven't been able to dig into more. And so with that, I know we've got to move on, but we wanted to thank you so much. And I'm going to walk away with that watering and fertilizing as something I'm going to bring to my own staff to help remind them that we've got work to do, and it falls on us as educators to make sure that our students are making that progress we need them to make. Thank you.
Awesome.
Thanks,
the connection.
Curtis.
With the connection.
With the connection.
Progress plus connection. Yep.
Love it.
Okay.
All right. Good
both.
to see you.
Thank you.
You as well.
All right.
Bye-bye.
All the best.
Bye-bye.
Bye.